Okay, I'm quite excited about this because I've been wanting to do it for quite a while. I'm going to look at Vim and Emacs and their approaches to text editing, ultimately evaluating them both. But in doing so, I'm really going to look at the so-called editor war and how we can get to grips with it and how we can overcome it. To give an overview of this whole presentation, you can see here all of the sections I'm going to go through, bearing in mind each section I plan to be a single video. So this video or section is the introduction. It's an introduction to the whole thing. It's setting the scene. So the section after is more about the historical background and an introduction of where Vim and Emacs come from, pretty much. So that means if you're already familiar with Vim and Emacs, you can skip these first two sections. So then section 3 really begins the whole evaluation of Vim and Emacs, where I look at the philosophy and approach that Vim and Emacs take, after which I'm going to look at their more concrete features, and then I'm going to compare those features. So section 4, when I look at the features, I'm really looking at those features in and of themselves, just to give an overview. But in section 5, that's where I begin to actually compare them. But section 6, I'm going to look at the options. So whether you want to try Vim or Emacs or some other editors that you might think would be better, I'm just going to give an overview of the landscape of current text editors as I know them to be. After that, I'm going to look at the learning resources that really helped me with Vim and Emacs. And finally, I am going to give my personal conclusion to the whole thing. So, without further ado, we can jump into the introduction section. First of all, why is text editing important? Well, when we say we are using a text editor or editing text, what we're really saying is we are editing plain text files that are meant to be interpreted and read as plain text files. This is in opposition to formatted files like Word files, where Microsoft Word, being the editor, is a WYSIWYG editor. That acronym, WYSIWYG, means what you see is what you get. And that makes sense. When you open a Word document in Word, you see the page or pages. You see the text in bold with the font size it's supposed to have. You see everything as it's supposed to be formatted and as it will all be in the end. But with a text editor, you're interpreting those plain text files as plain text files. All you see are character streams and lines. Really, all you're seeing is visible and invisible characters, where the only special characters that are interpreted by a plain text editor are things like new lines and tabs, but they're kind of invisible. You don't see them, but you see the effect they have on the formatting, right? With tabs, they indent text. With new lines, they start a new line, and the text editor displays that. But that's it. That's it. All you have is plain text, lines of characters in a plain text file if you read that file as plain text. But with formatted files like Word, where you have text in bold, not only is that formatting information stored in the Word file, but also when you interpret that Word file, it's interpreted as bold text as it would come out, right? You cannot have bold text, underlined text, or anything like that in plain text files if you are interpreting them as plain text files. So if you want to see all that extra stuff, font colors, font sizes, all that sort of thing, most of that stuff is dependent on the settings of the text editor you use, but if you want to embed that information in the file, you can't. So that's the difference between a plain text file and a formatted file. Now, why would you want a plain text file? Where would you use them? So the reason they are useful is because they are ultimately the most basic file format for human readable information. Therefore, they are, or they have, very low overhead. And that's very useful for having system configuration files or programming source files where you don't want a lot of overhead because the compilers or programs that interpret those text files, they really would be a lot faster if they just interpret them in a plain kind of format. Hence, they use plain text. And because they use plain text or interpret plain text, we have to edit those files as plain text so that we know exactly what those programs or compilers are seeing. So, in a nutshell, text editing matters to anyone in the programming or software development sectors, including hardware engineering and system admin. So incredibly useful in the context of software. But, truth be told, all non-binary files, that is, all non-executable files, can be read as plain text. Well, even executable files can be read as plain text, right? It's important here to make the distinction between a file and whether we interpret that file as plain text or not, right? Because you can interpret a file, any file, as plain text. Whether it makes sense or is complete gibberish on the screen is the next thing, right? So plain text files that are meant to be edited as plain text files is what text editors are used for. But any file can be interpreted as plain text. You're just changing the way you see or interpret the special characters, the bytes within the file. So even a Word file you can interpret as plain text. It will probably come out as some sort of set of special XML files, right? Containing all the formatting tags and that sort of thing. But you would not want to edit a Word file like that. It would be so much pain. Hence we have something like Microsoft Word where we can edit it as we would see it. So hopefully that's a good overview of why text editing is important in the first place. Why I'm making this fuss, really. So the next thing is, what is Vim and Emacs then? Well, they are text editors. They come from a time around the 1970s where there was no such thing as a graphical interface, Windows. They were originally, both of them, terminal applications. They were presented on a terminal screen that could only display text. But over the years, with the development of graphical interfaces, they both have some options for a kind of GUI, a graphical user interface. For Vim, that would be GVim. More on that in the options section. But Emacs is a bit of a funny one. It's kind of developed in such a way that the default way of using it is with its GUI, graphical user interface. I will say that Emacs's GUI is a lot more fully fledged than Vim's sort of GUI, that being GVim. Simply because GVim is a copy-paste of what you would see in the terminal in its own dedicated window, but it doesn't have any capability for things like showing images. But that's only because terminals, by convention, don't support showing images. There are some modern terminal emulators that can sort of show images, but you know, the use case, I don't know about the use cases, but anyway, the key point is both of these programs have very unique approaches to editing, text editing, and very different ideas behind what a development environment should kind of look like by default. So from those unique approaches, you have a set of people that might use Emacs and Vim, and they're pushing forward their tool as being better than the other. Therefore, you get what we call the editor war. So the editor war, first of all, should not be taken seriously. I mean, at the end of the day, Vim and Emacs, they're just text editors. I say just, I mean, for some people it's their their whole careers, right? Editing text as a programmer, for example. But they are, at the end of the day, just programs, tools, software. That's it. So the idea that the editor war is anything serious should just be shoved straight out the window. Because ultimately, unnecessary tribalism and division is usually pretty bad. We know that, obviously. So to treat it seriously is to adopt an unnecessary tribalism. Therefore, we shouldn't take it seriously. But there's humor involved in this editor war. If we just go to the Wikipedia page, which I've got open here, you can see the two sections on the left. We've got background and humor. You can see the background section is tiny, and the humor section is massive. Yeah. So if you want to take anything away from the editor war, it's probably the humor. It's just pretty funny. It's basically people who like Emacs poking at the people who use Vim, and the people who use Vim are poking at the people who use Emacs. It's fun. It's really fun. I mean, this here on the right, first of all, is Richard Stallman. He's the founder of the GNU project, and that is the overseer of the development of Emacs, or more precisely GNU Emacs. Therefore, he is kind of like the head, so-called head of the Church of Emacs, which is, yeah, the whole Emacs side of the editor war. And my goodness, yeah. For example, he says the editor of the beast, whoopsie daisy, he says, what is it? Yeah. Vi is the editor of the beast, sorry. Because you have VI rendered as Roman numerals is 666, which is the number of the beast, right? So it's pretty funny stuff. Then you got the people on the Vim side or Vi side. Again, we'll look at this in the history next, but they say, if you use Emacs, you're going to kill your pinky finger because you have to press Control and Alt and Shift 10 times every second. And they say you're going to get some hand injuries or something like that. So, just poking. Obviously, if you take it seriously, it is, not good and pointless, but the humor is gold. Anyway. The main point is, I do think it is important to look at the editor war. Not really because of the humor or because it's serious in any way, but because it points to how we should treat our tools, how we should use them. Of course, in the context of software engineering, but really I think the points it highlights could be brought to any kind of engineering sector where you are using specific tools for a specific job, no matter what. So that's why I want to bring this in a bit. And all of the sections I will look at, but primarily the philosophy and approach section, will bring this to light a lot more. Now, I'm going to finish off with my qualifications in essence. So in the beginning, I used Emacs. This was around university times, although I think I started using Emacs in 2018 during my A-levels. So I've been using it. I started using Emacs maybe, how old am I? Well, what year is it? 25. So yeah, like 7 years ago. So I got a fair amount of history, not as much history compared to, a fair few others who have been using it for decades, as I said before, but still, I think quite a longish time. But anyway, I spent 4 years just using Emacs. For university, I used it in my courses, but in my dissertation also, where I programmed in Haskell and used LaTeX constantly for reports and things, but we also did Python, MATLAB projects, that sort of thing. So it's, mainly during uni I used Emacs. But to be honest, I did not use Emacs to its full potential at all. At all. I literally just use it as a drag and drop editor, right? I saw my text file in my GUI file manager. dragged it into Emacs, edited it, and then that's it. But I still did get very, very familiar with Emacs, using the default key bindings, getting to know its system of how buffers work and windows work. Windows and buffers we'll get onto later, but the whole ecosystem of ideas but behind Emacs, but also Vim, because they both come from a time where GUIs or Windows, graphical user interfaces didn't exist in operating systems. So when we use the word buffer or window, it actually doesn't mean what you might think if you haven't used Vim or Emacs before. But anyway, I got familiar with it and it was really good, really good. But I did not use it to its full potential at all. I didn't use the inbuilt terminal environments. I didn't use the file navigation mode, which is called DIRED in Emacs. So I didn't embrace it as fully as I could. But anyway, after that, I spent a year with Vim, maybe a bit more, but I read half the Vim manual, the Vim user manual, wherein I got the best foundation I could have ever got in Vim. I learned more about Vim in 1 year using that manual than I did using Emacs for 4 years. Right? That should tell you how useful the manual is. And the same thing could be said, I think, if you read the Emacs manual, which I did not do. Maybe not all of it, because I know it's quite big, but, reading the first half, or the main parts about using it as an editor, for example, because Emacs is much more than an editor, and we'll get onto that. But anyway, I used Vim for a year, then I used Emacs again for a year after that, because I realized I did not use it well at all. I didn't use it how it's supposed to be used by default. But then after that, I went back to Vim, wherein I use Vim now for all my programming, because I came to appreciate, really, after trying both, the default approach that Vim has. But I still use Emacs with org mode and org agenda, which are two very useful features of Emacs. But also for some prose writing, I find for prose, long paragraphs, long textual paragraphs, Emacs seems to handle it a bit more smoothly, but even then I'm using Vim sometimes with even prose. So it's very much, in the balance. But 100% I will always use Emacs for org mode, because org mode is the feature of Emacs that allows you to schedule things, basically, and I will be using that for the foreseeable future. So I will always be using Emacs anyway to some degree, to my knowledge. But anyway, those are my qualifications. I hope you can see that I've been using both Emacs and Vim for some time, and hopefully, therefore, I have some weight to my words when I talk about them. But by now, you should hopefully see that text editing is quite important. You should know that what the editor war is and why it's fairly important, and also what Vim and Emacs are, although we're going to look more into that in the next section, which is history. So thank you very much for listening to this video, watching it, and I hope you join me for the next one. Thank you very much.